As you know, there's a place on the back of your bulletin if you want to take any notes that might be useful to you as you continue this journey with Paul and try to understand his life's meaning for your life. It's almost been like a travel log that we've been taking, but I think it's important to do this because there's a reason that Luke wrote in great detail of Paul's travels, so that we can have this appreciation for this great evangelist. And last week, you might remember that we were leaving Ephesus at the end of chapter 20. So if you have your Bibles with you, or grab a Bible from your pews, you can follow along. And Paul is heading back to Jerusalem from his third missionary experience. And he arrives in Tyre, northern part of the Holy Land on the western coast, in the spring of 57 A.D. And he wants to gather together and tell these believers all that's happened during this last missionary trip. So he's telling them about all the ways that the good news was preached throughout Greece and in Macedonia, in Corinth and Ephesus, the struggles that he had, but how churches have been firmly planted. And then he went to Caesarea, and from there he went on to Jerusalem, where he was excited to give a gift that he had taken a collection from all the churches to give to the mother church back in Jerusalem. So he meets with James, the brother of Jesus, and the elders of this Jerusalem church, and he presents them with the collection, and they're not really all that impressed with the money and all the effort and pressures and the sacrifices that were made in gathering it. Instead, they want to talk about and tell Paul of these negative feelings that have been expressed about him in Jerusalem from the Jewish community, and question him about what he was teaching when he was in Ephesus and beyond. So in chapter 21, verse 20, you read, and I think this is James speaking, "You see, brother, how many thousands of believers there are among the Jews, and they are all zealous for the law. They have been told about you that you teach all the Jews living among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, and that you tell them not to circumcise their children or to observe the customs. What then is to be done? They will certainly hear that you have come." Understand the infighting that was taking place. Paul never discouraged Jews from following the law. He was mainly preaching that salvation was not living in the law, but it was totally based on faith in Jesus Christ. So while Paul was in the temple, Jews from Ephesus had heard that he was in town, so they came over to the courts and they began shouting, "Fellow Israelites, help! This is the man who is teaching everyone everywhere against our people, our law, and this place." They even accused Paul of bringing Gentiles into the inner courts of the temple, which he had not done at all. And they rushed him and they grabbed him and they drug him out of the temple. And in their rage, they were about to kill him for what they considered blasphemy. Here he is coming back from that amazing journey to Jerusalem and is received in this manner. In fact, Paul probably would have been killed except for this quick response from the Roman soldiers. They are stationed at what's called Fortress Antonia, right next to the temple, and they're always watching for any unrest and any disturbances that are going on, because they're there to quell any violence. So when they saw this outbreak, they rushed to find out what was happening, and they arrested Paul, as much to save him as well as to quell the disturbance. As Paul is taken away by the Romans, he's allowed to speak to the crowd from the steps of the temple. So this would be the first of two lengthy testimonies about his Damascus Road experience. He tells this story. It's recorded 3 times in the book of Acts, but we're going to hear it here, and then we're also going to hear it in a trial before King Agrippa in the 26th chapter of Acts. So after he tells of his faith journey and his conversion, the crowd yells, "Away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live." That's in Acts 22:22. The soldiers were about to flog him and maybe getting him to confess what the Jews accused him of. And he said to them, "Are you going to flog me, a Roman citizen, before any kind of a trial?" So there was a trial. This would be the first of 5 such trials while he was in the Holy Land. And again, he gives a testimony of faith. The next day, he's before the Sanhedrin. Now, you know, that's the Jewish council. This is what Paul always aspired to be a part of before his conversion. These learned Jews. And his testimony, his boldness, caused another uproar. And again, the soldiers have to come and save him. And then in the evening, Jesus appears to him in a dream and says, "Be encouraged, Paul. Just as you have told the people about me here in Jerusalem, you must preach the good news in Rome." The next evening, when a plot by the Jewish leaders to kill Paul was discovered, he had to be transferred by night to Jerusalem. There was a group of men that were going to come where he was staying and kill him. So 40 Jewish men had taken an oath that before they ate again, they would kill Paul of Tarsus. So in Caesarea, there's a great contingent of soldiers that take him up north to Caesarea on the sea. And he's there, and he gives another testimony, another defense before the governor of Judea, Antonius Felix. And they bring Jews from Jerusalem, and Ananias the high priest and some of the Jewish leaders and a lawyer were there. And they said, "Paul has been inciting Jews throughout the world to riot and rebel against Rome." If nothing else was going to work, they were going to talk about how Paul was creating this disturbance and this upsetness against the Roman government. And it says in the 24th chapter and the 23rd verse that Felix ordered the centurion to keep him in custody, but to let him have some liberty and not to prevent any of his friends from taking care of his needs. He was there in prison in Caesarea for 2 years, waiting for a decision to be made as to what to do with him. And finally, Felix's successor comes on the scene, Porcius Festus. And some have said that during that 2-year period in prison, that's where Paul wrote Philemon, Colossians, and the epistle to Ephesians. With Porcius Festus as the new Roman governor of Judea, the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem petitioned again to come to Caesarea and testify against Paul in hopes that they could get him, and it would say in Scripture, and to kill him. There was these efforts to kill this evangelist at almost every turn. So when Festus heard the testimony, and he said that maybe I ought to turn you over to the Jews. Paul again said, I'm a Roman citizen. I need to be tried before the emperor. So in the 25th chapter, verse 12, Festus says, very well, you have appealed to Caesar, and to Caesar you shall go. This is the journey that's going to get him to Rome. Several days later, King Agrippa II and his sister Bernice come to Caesarea, and they're coming to welcome Festus and as the new governor of Judea. Agrippa is this young 32-year-old king, and he's a Jew. He's one of the last of, he is the last of Herod's line. He's been educated in Rome. He's a real friend of the Romans and was appointed by the emperor to serve a vast territory that today includes southern Syria all the way to the Golan Heights and parts of the Galilee. So when Festus tells him about Paul, Agrippa says, I'd like to see him myself. So again, Paul testifies and gives his faith story. And this is recounted in great detail, and it's beautiful to read. And after Agrippa, the Jewish king, hears this in chapter 26, verse 32, he said, this man is doing nothing to deserve death or imprisonment. In fact, the King James Version, I love it, in the 28th verse of the 26th chapter says, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. Paul, he was that close. He tells Festus at the end, Agrippa, this man could have been set free if he had not appealed to the emperor. Now, we're set for our trip to Rome, the last trip. And that begins in chapter 27 of Acts. So if you want to follow along, I'm going to share some of that, and then we're going to hear Tracy Radosevic sharing scripture on a boat out in the Aegean Sea, and that's where Paul was spending a good bit of the time. So Acts 27, the first verse. When the time came, we set sail for Italy. Paul and several other prisoners were placed in the custody of a Roman officer named Julius, a captain of the imperial regiment. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was also with us. We left on the ship whose home port was at Adamyttium on the northwest coast of the province of Asia. It was scheduled to make several stops at ports along the coast of the province. You're going to see now on screen the journey that he takes. The next day, when we docked in Sidon, Julius was kind to Paul and let him go ashore to visit with friends so they could provide for his need. We're just still along the coast of Judea. Putting out to sea from there, we encountered strong headwinds that made it difficult to keep the ship on course. So we sailed north to Cyprus. If you can find Cyprus to the east, that island, between the island and the mainland. Keeping to the open sea, we passed along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, landing in Myra in the province of Lycia. There, the commanding officer found an Egyptian ship from Alexandria that was bound for Italy, and he put us on board. We had several days of slow sailing, and after great difficulty, we finally neared Cnidus. But the winds were against us, so we sailed across to Crete and along the sheltered coast of the island, past the Cape of Salmone. Listen to the detail. We struggled along the coast with great difficulty and finally arrived at Fair Havens near the town of Lasea. Now, let's think for a moment of why would these travels be given in such great detail other than to tell us not only of the reality of what actually happened, but of the amazing courage that Paul undertook. Verse 9, we had lost a lot of time. The weather was becoming dangerous for sea travel because it was so late in the fall. And Paul spoke to the ship's officers about it. Men, he said, I believe there is trouble ahead if we go on. Shipwreck, loss of cargo, and danger to our lives as well. But the officer in charge of the prisoners listened more to the ship's captain and the owner than to Paul. And since Fairhavens was an exposed harbor, a poor place to spend the winter, most of the crew wanted to go on to Phoenix, farther up the coast of Crete, and spend the winter there. Phoenix was a good harbor with only a southwest and northwest exposure. When a light wind began blowing from the south, the sailors thought they could make it. So they pulled up anchor and sailed close to the shore of Crete. Now, we want to hear Tracy, and she's going to, as the boat that we're on is swaying, she's going to tell you another little snippet of this story, starting with verse 14.
Violent wind, like a hurricane strength wind, rushed down from Crete, and it enveloped the ship. I mean, we were so stuck in this storm that we couldn't even turn around to face the wind, and so all we could do was let it carry us along, which is what we did. It pounded us violently, and finally we got a little bit of shelter under the lee of a little island called Cauda. And it was at that point, with great difficulty, that we finally got control of the lifeboat and were able to hoist it up aboard. And then the sailors, they wrapped a cable around the ship just to hold it together. And then they started worrying that we were going to run into the sandbars in the Gulf of Syrtis. So they dropped the sea anchor. But we still continued to drift along. Well, we were sailing along, being pounded by this violent storm. And the men, they had not eaten for many, many days. We were so rampaged by this storm that the sailors started to throw the cargo overboard. And then on the third day, with their own hands, they started to toss over the gear and the tackle and the equipment. And then when the sun and the stars did not appear for many, many days, but that violent raging storm continued to pound us, that was when we lost hope that we would ever be saved.
So they lost hope that they would ever be saved. Verse 21 says, since they had been without food for a long time, Paul then stood up among them, the people of the ship, and said, men, you should have listened to me and not set sail from Crete, and thereby avoided this damage and loss. I urge you now to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For last night there stood by me an angel of the God to whom I belong and of whom I worship. And he said, do not be afraid, Paul. This is, of course, Jesus Christ speaking. You must stand before the emperor, and indeed God has granted safety to all those who are sailing with you. So keep up your courage, men, Paul said, for I have faith in God that will be exactly as I have been told. But we will have to run aground on some island. We spent a lot of time, at least 3 days, on some of the Grecian islands. I wish we had time to share what happened as we were on those islands. Anybody that travels to Greece loves to travel to the islands, and it's great beauty, great food. We were on Crete, and that picture on your cover is of the island of Crete, where Paul was. The island of Santorini is a beautiful island, but it wasn't so beautiful in the way that Paul had to experience it. So, verse 27 says, about midnight on the 14th night of the storm, 2 constant weeks, as we were being driven across the Sea of Adria, the sailors sensed land was near. They dropped a weighted line and found that the water was 120 feet deep. But a little later they measured again and found it was only 90 feet deep. At this rate, they were afraid we would soon be driven against the rocks along the shore. So they threw out 4 anchors from the back of the ship and prayed for daylight. Then the sailors tried to abandon the ship. They lowered the lifeboat as though they were going to put out anchors from the front of the ship. But Paul said to the commanding officer and the soldiers, "You will all die unless the sailors stay aboard." So the soldiers cut the ropes to the lifeboat and let it drift away. Just as day was dawning, Paul urged everyone to eat. You have been so worried that you haven't touched food for 2 weeks, he said. Please eat something now for your own good, for not a hair on your heads will perish. Think of how Paul was trying to minister to all of the people that were there as his captors. Then he took some bread. Now think of the image of the Eucharist. Gave thanks to God before them all and broke off a piece and ate it. Then everyone was encouraged and began to eat. All 276 of us who were on board. After eating, the crew lightened the ship further by throwing the cargo of wheat overboard. When morning dawned, they didn't recognize the coastline, but they saw a bay with a beach and wondered if they could get to shore by running the ship aground. And I'm going to skip ahead because they're going to end up on this island called Malta. And an interesting story happens on this island of Malta when they finally arrive. And it begins on chapter 28, verse 1. After we had reached safely, we learned that the island was called Malta. The natives showed us unusual kindness. Since it had begun to rain and was cold, they kindled a fire and welcomed all of us around it. Paul had gathered a bundle of brushwood and was putting it on the fire when a viper, driven out by the heat, fastened itself on his hand. When the natives saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, "This man must be a murderer. Though he has escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live." Paul, however, shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. They were expecting him to swell up or drop dead, but after they had waited a long time and saw that nothing unusual had happened to him, they changed their minds and began to say he was a god. Now in the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to the leading man of the island, named Publius, and who received us and entertained us hospitably for 3 days. It so happened that the father of Publius lay sick in bed with fever and dysentery. Paul visited him and cured him by praying and putting his hands on him. After this, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases also came and were cured. They bestowed many honors on us when we were about to sail. They put on board all the provisions that we needed. One of the things I think about this experience in Malta, the people there were not Christians. They were just people that natives to that island, and yet they did godly things. Now Paul writes about that. He was saying, how can the Spirit of Jesus Christ exist in people that have never heard the Word? In Romans 2, verses 14 to 15, Paul writes, when outsiders who have never heard of God's law follow it more or less by instinct, they confirm its truth by their obedience. They show that God's law is not something alien, imposed on us from without, but woven into the very fabric of our creation. That the Spirit of God, that actually, I believe, that Christ himself resides in all of human life. Many people don't recognize it, don't acknowledge it, but when you see these acts of goodwill, that's Christ welling up in all of us, and that's why it gives us hope as we preach to anyone, that we may connect with the very Spirit that is within them. So Paul stays on this island of Malta for 3 months. And then he finally travels on to Rome, and he arrives there in the spring of 60 A.D. He's traveled almost 2,000 miles by ship, and it was a tough journey. Under the best of conditions, it would have taken a month, and that's allowing even for some stops, but it took Paul and that crew of 276 5 to 6 months. Listen to what Paul writes in 1 Corinthians, the 11th chapter, verse 24. And this was written before his trip to Rome, so he could add to the totals as he shares. 5 times I have received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I received a stoning. 3 times I was shipwrecked. Now he could easily say 4. For a night and a day I was adrift at sea, on frequent journeys and dangers from rivers, danger from bandits, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers and sisters, in toil and hardship through many a sleepless night, hungry and thirsty, often without food, cold and naked. Again, this was before this last trip. And besides other things, I am under daily pressure because of my anxiety for all of the churches. This is a mighty evangelist who withstood assault even from other believers for all of his journeys. He lands in Rome. In Rome he had many friends. In the epistle that he writes to the Romans, he closes by sending greetings to 26 people, many women, some his own family members. Most appear to have been leaders of the church in Rome. Based on what Paul writes in Romans 16, there seemed to be multiple churches in Rome by the mid-50s, but by the time he arrives, the number of churches had expanded. So Paul's put under house arrest until he can be seen by the court of the emperor. And we learn that he was under house arrest for 2 years, able to see people, able to minister, able to preach, but still under house arrest. The book of Acts ends abruptly. If you turn to the very last 2 verses in chapter 28 that closes out the book of Acts, it reads, Paul lived there 2 whole years at his own expense and welcomed all who came to him, proclaiming the kingdom of God and teaching about the Lord Jesus Christ with all boldness and without hindrance. Tradition has it that Paul died, that he was hung to death in Rome. You wonder why that wasn't shared. And there's a lot of theories behind that. There was a thought that everybody knew that Paul had died and the way that he died, but they wanted to recall his life because they felt his life was what was going to give life to the church and not his death. Many times when we have caskets and we're having a funeral, we keep the casket closed because we want people to remember the life of the person and not the death of the person. I want to share one story that caught my attention on Tuesday this week. And I don't know if any of you saw it. To me, it was the most beautiful story that happened at the Olympics. There was a 5K that was a women's 5K that was run, and with 4 laps to go, there was a New Zealander by the name of Nikki Hamblin and a U.S. runner by the name of Abby Diacostino who got tangled up. And Nikki Hamblin from New Zealand lost her footing, and she stumbled and went face forward. And that's when Abby Diacostino stumbled over her, and she ultimately went down as well. The U.S. runner, Abby, gets right up, and she comes over to her competitor, and she reaches out to her and tells her that she must get up and that she must finish the race. Now, I want you to remember how significant that is. So talk to anybody that's a runner. If you stop to do something like that, you have foregone the race. And these two women had trained for years to make it to this event. The U.S. runner, Abby D'Agostino, was from Dartmouth. She's the most prized runner in Ivy League history. And the sacrifice that she made over years to get there was amazing. But she decides to turn around and give up that race because of the other girl that was on the ground. Other runners had passed the New Zealander. Then, a few seconds later, after she got the New Zealander up, Abby falls, and she's writhing in pain. And we see a picture of what's happening as she is in pain. The New Zealand girl has now gone back to help her, remembering what has just happened a few seconds before. They both finished last, considerably last. The New Zealand girl, Nikki Hamblin, said, "When I went down, it was like, what's happening? Why am I on the ground? And suddenly there's this hand on my shoulder like, get up, we have to finish this." I'm so grateful for Abby for doing that for me. That girl is the Olympic spirit right there. I've never met anyone like her before. It's so amazing. The American girl, Abby D'Agostino, actually tore her ACL and strained her MCL. How she got back up and ran, no one really knows. They both were given a special dispensation and allowed to run in the next heat, but Abby couldn't run because she was on crutches and she had to watch it from the stands. The New Zealand girl, Nikki, ran, but because her ankle and her legs were so hurting, that she finished a long last on Friday this past week when they got a chance to run again. The American girl, Abby, said, "We were part of a message that was being delivered to a lot of people through that race. It's connected Nikki and me in a way that's powerful. It's beginning of a relationship that neither one of us will ever forget. We live on opposite sides of the world, and our paths won't cross frequently. We will keep in touch and share our story." The New Zealand girl, Nikki, said, "When I look back on Rio 2016, I'm not going to remember where I finished. I'm not going to remember my time, but I always remember that moment. Sometimes I guess you have to remember trying to be a good human being is more important than anything else. If I hadn't waited for her or tried to help her, I would have been 10 or 15 seconds quicker. And what does that matter?" And then Abby says, "Although my actions were instinctual at that moment, the way I can and have rationalized it is that God prepared my heart to respond that way. This whole time here, He's made clear to me that my experience in Rio was going to be more about that moment than about my race performance. And as soon as Nikki got up, I knew that was the moment." And then Nikki says, "You can make friends in the moments that really should break your heart." I don't know about the New Zealand girl, whether she was Christian or had any faith at all, but like Paul said, there was a Christ spirit that was within her that was stronger than anything else, including all of her desires. But Abby was a part of the Fellowship of Christian Athletes and was a great believer in Jesus Christ. And she realized that her injury in that moment was to proclaim Jesus Christ to an international world. They were on one television program after another, including Good Morning America the next day. So if you didn't know that story, know that story. And that's kind of isn't that the story of Paul, who in spite of injury and flogging, continued on. I don't know how you run with a torn ACL and finish a race, and only finished it 2 minutes slower than her best time, her her PR. Dave, you ought to tell me how that happens. I don't understand. But I do understand there's a power in this Lord of ours that overcomes everything, overcomes dissension, overcomes assault, overcomes goals that we had set for ourselves that need to be retooled. And in the end, when we are followers, we say that following this Jesus Christ and proclaiming the gospel, as Paul did to the time that he was killed, was all that life is about. And that's what we get to do as a church, is to be about proclaiming.